Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, where Dr. Andrew Leigh makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He's been here previously with his books, and most recently the book, The History of Economics, which went very well. And tonight talking on the topic of the great unbinding, non-competes, freedom, and the future of competition. And of course, he's was the member for Fraser in the Australian Capital Territory. The name of the electorate was changed to Fenner after 2016. And most importantly, he's an assistant minister, or the assistant minister for the Treasury, and tonight on the topic I just mentioned. You're very welcome. Thank you.
I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. Anne and Gerard Henderson, thank you for having me back for a fourth time to speak at the Sydney Institute, an institution with an abiding belief in the competition of ideas. Let me start with three stories. A laundromat manager in a small regional town was made redundant. Instead of just receiving a thank you and a payout, she was given a letter claiming she had an implied restraint. For a year, she was told, she couldn't work in the same industry. She'd never agreed to such a clause, yet the threat hung over her. Take another laundry job in town and you could end up in court. A health worker on less than $80,000 read his contract and saw a restraint with no end date at all. Indefinite, it said. And the scope? Not just his neighbourhood, but all of Australia and New Zealand. His employer might as well have written, you can work anywhere in the world, so long as it's not here. And then there was the graduate engineer, starting out on $63,000. His contract banned him from working for any competitor, anywhere in Victoria, for 12 months. For a young worker at the beginning of his career, it felt less like a career ladder, more like a trapdoor. These aren't the contracts of CEOs plotting corporate takeovers. They're the contracts of ordinary Australians, people trying to pay the bills, build a career, or use the skills they've worked hard to earn. Instead, they find themselves shackled by clauses that say, don't even think about moving. Non-compete clauses used to be rare. Now they're spreading like mould in a bathroom, showing up where they don't belong and doing damage along the way. They stifle wages, block mobility, and bottle up ideas. For workers, they punish initiative. For the economy, they act like sand in the gears. That's why Treasurer Chalmers announced in this year's budget that from 2027, we're getting rid of non-competes for workers earning under the Fair Work Act's high income threshold, $183,100 in 2025-26. We'll also outlaw wage fixing and no-poach agreements, which quietly turn labour markets into cosy cartels. Because good reform means listening as well as legislating. Treasury ran a consultation over the winter. Submissions closed just last week. Many made the point that non-competes are holding Australians back. Tonight I want to take you through the case for change. I'll start with the stories and the statistics about what non-competes do to workers and to the wider economy. Then I'll talk about the government's reform, how we're reshaping the rules to give Australians back their freedom to move. Finally, I'll place this in the broader picture, our competition reform agenda, and how it can help us build a fairer, more dynamic economy. At their core, non-compete clauses are handcuffs on mobility. They tell workers, yes, you can resign, but don't think about immediately taking your skills to a competitor or starting up on your own. It's like your favourite show ending on a cliffhanger and the next season isn't out for months. Only here the stakes aren't about plot twists, but paychecks. For workers, the costs of non-competes are obvious. People get stuck in jobs they've outgrown. They forego pay rises because the alternative is unemployment. They shelve their skills and start again in a different field. And as I'll shortly outline, the research shows that hits workers' wallets hard. For the economy, the effects are just as damaging. When workers can't move, ideas don't spread. New firms don't start. Innovation slows down. Non-competes are like a do not disturb sign hanging over the whole economy. They might protect a complacent manager, but they hold back the country. The harm isn't just theoretical. Over recent years, employees have shared examples of contracts that would make your head spin. It's hard to imagine a better way of killing off aspiration than telling someone they can't use their own skills without a lawyer's permission. So non-competes don't just hurt individuals. They're a drag on wages, on dynamism, and on growth. They're also a classic case of a private contract creating a public problem. One of the striking things about the Treasury consultation that's just wrapped up was how ordinary the shackled workers were and how extreme the restraints. These aren't people with share options and corner suites. They're people folding clothes, providing care, answering phones. Non-competes are showing up in sectors where there's no trade secret to protect. They're not about safeguarding sensitive information. They're about scaring people away from moving. Employees shared story after story of contracts written with such sweeping restrictions you'd think they were drafted for Cold War spies, not everyday workers. We saw restraints that lasted years and geographic limits that stretched not just across suburbs but across states. Clauses so broad that they could have been copied and pasted from one employer to the next, which, judging by the clumsy wording in some of them, is probably exactly what happened. One particular problem raised in the consultation was the use of so-called cascading clauses. These are contracts that set out not one restraint, but half a dozen. They might say a restriction lasts 10 years, or 5 years, or 2 years, or 1 year. It might cover all of Australia, or a single state, or a city, or a 5-kilometre radius around the workplace. The idea behind their drafting is that even if the longest or broadest version is struck down, some smaller version will survive. Lawyers call it the blue pencil doctrine, because judges can cross out words until a clause looks more reasonable. But from the point of view of a worker reading their contract, the message is unmistakable. You're boxed in. Faced with a clause that looks like it was drafted with a dartboard, most people simply won't risk moving at all. The uncertainty is the point, and that uncertainty is corrosive, keeps people in jobs they would otherwise leave, and stops growing firms from hiring the talent they need. And it works. Time and again, employees said the same thing. Even if they suspected the clause was unenforceable, they weren't willing to risk a lawsuit to test it. For most workers, the threat of legal action is enough to close off options. In that sense, non-competes are a lawyer's dream and a worker's nightmare. The harm done by non-competes can be broader than just for the affected workers. When a nurse is discouraged from changing employers, patients lose out too. Continuity of care suffers, waiting lists grow longer, and shortages in aged care and disability services become even more acute. Non-competes that block nurses from moving jobs are effectively restraints on patients as well. Or take another example. Australia is in the midst of an energy transition with an urgent need for skilled electrical workers to move rapidly to the projects where their expertise is most required. Non-competes that tell electricians they can't take up work with a new employer slow down the very projects that are meant to get us to net zero. They turn a private contract into a roadblock for the whole country. Pharmacists, too, have been caught in contracts that prohibit them from working within a few kilometres of their former employer for up to 2 years. In regional towns, that's the difference between staying employed or leaving the community altogether. For patients, it means fewer local options to fill prescriptions or seek advice, a competition problem that quickly becomes a health problem. So the message from the consultation couldn't have been clearer. Non-competes are no longer rare, limited, or reasonable. They're widespread, heavy-handed, and harmful, not only for individual workers, but for the public services and national priorities that rely on them. The submissions gave us stories. Alongside this, surveys and economic research shows just how widespread non-competes have become and what they mean for the economy. In Australia, surveys show that around 1 in 5 employees, more than 3 million people, are bound by non-competes. An Australian Bureau of Statistics survey of employers found that usage was especially high in finance, 40%, and in rental and real estate services, 33%. Larger businesses are about twice as likely as smaller ones to rely on them. The survey of employers found that businesses that used non-competes applied them to more than 3/4 of their workforce. It also suggested that the usage of non-compete clauses has risen over time. A survey by the E61 Institute of employees shows that non-competes are present across industries and occupations, including yoga instructors, cleaners, and gig workers. Non-competes are now common in occupations that once would never have dreamed of using them. To understand the damage done by non-competes, it's useful to start with mobility. Job mobility is one of the clearest signs of a healthy labour market. Economists use it as a gauge of dynamism, like run metres gained tells you how a rugby league team is making the most of every opportunity. Analysis by the E61 Institute shows that job switching delivers a typical wage boost of around $5,700 a year. For younger workers, the gains are closer to $7,500. Even for those who stay put, outside options improve bargaining power. When workers move, ideas move too, helping new firms spread innovation across the economy. As you might expect, non-competes reduce job mobility. Employees bound by them are less likely to change jobs, less likely to move into a role that better matches their skills, less likely to start a new business. What should be a normal career step instead feels like a legal hazard. Consequently, Australian workers with non-competes earn about 4% less than those without. For someone on a typical income, that's about $2,500 a year foregone. International research tells a similar story. A new study by Matthew Johnson, Kurt Levetti, and Michael Lipsitz, just published in the Journal of Political Economy, tracked changes in how non-competes were enforced across US states over 2 decades. They found stricter enforcement reduced earnings and lowered mobility. Their estimate was that banning enforceable non-competes nationwide would lift average US wages by between 3.5 and 13.7%, with the midpoint at 8.6%. To put that in perspective, that's about half the wage premium that unions deliver. Their study also found that the burden isn't shared equally. Women and non-white workers bore roughly twice the earnings penalty of others. It's worth emphasising a key point. The Journal of Political Economy study focused on enforcement because the evidence shows that even when non-competes are technically unenforceable, many firms continue to use them. Such employers rely on the chilling effect. Workers see the clause, fear the legal risk, and stay put. The contract does its work, even if it would never survive a courtroom challenge. That's why many have suggested it may not be sufficient to declare these clauses void. We may also need to make it unlawful to include them in the first place. This new study supports the findings from earlier research. When Oregon banned non-competes for low-wage workers, wages rose 2 to 3%. Hawaii's ban on non-competes in the tech sector lifted new higher pay by 4% and helped spur a 10% increase in the number of tech firms. Since 1872, non-competes have been unenforceable in California. One reason why Silicon Valley came to dominate technology was that workers could walk out to create new firms. Those examples underline the same lesson. Remove restraints and you free up pay packets, mobility, and entrepreneurship. Put together, the evidence is unambiguous. Non-competes are becoming more prevalent, they push down wages, they hold back job mobility, and they act as a brake on entrepreneurship and innovation. When we talk about reforming non-competes, a few familiar objections pop up. Let me run through the greatest hits. The first is that common law already offers protection. In theory, courts begin with the presumption that a restraint of trade is against the public interest and only uphold it if it is narrowly tailored to protect a genuine business interest. In practice, the story is very different. Employers can and do seek injunctions at the first hint that a worker might join a competitor. The threshold for an interim injunction is relatively low. Once granted, it effectively decides the case because the employee can't work in the meantime and few can afford the long, expensive battle to trial. The imbalance of resources between employer and employee means that many restraints never get tested at all. The doctrine that was meant to protect the public interest in mobility has become a shield for employers and a sword against employees. What looks balanced in a law textbook plays out very differently in the real world. The second objection, somewhat at odds with the first, as you'll see, is that employers need non-competes to protect their secrets. But Australia already has a toolkit for that. We have intellectual property law. We have confidentiality agreements. We have non-disclosure clauses. You don't need a non-compete to keep the recipe for Coca-Cola safe. You don't need a blowtorch to toast a marshmallow. The third argument is that workers agree to these clauses. But US evidence shows only about 1 in 10 employees ever negotiates their non-compete. Let's be honest, most fresh hires aren't haggling over restraint terms when they're signing a new job contract. They're focused on the salary, the hours, whether they can get time off for Christmas. Non-competes are usually buried in the fine print, offered on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. Calling that agreement is like saying you chose the middle seat on a packed flight or chose clause 17 in the contract for the software you just installed in your phone. The fourth claim is that non-competes encourage firms to invest in training. The idea is that if workers are prevented from leaving, firms will feel more secure in skilling them up. But that turns the logic of training on its head. The best way to keep staff isn't to lock the door. It's to create a workplace where people want to stay. If training makes someone a much better worker, maybe they do deserve a pay rise. Look after your employees. Give them career progression. Make sure they feel valued. Chains are a poor substitute for loyalty. So when you look closely, the case for non-competes crumbles. Under current common law arrangement, non-competes are reducing productive job mobility. Once non-competes are removed from most workers, the real protections for employers will still remain in place. Few people negotiate over their non-compete clause, and the training argument is more wishful thinking than economic analysis. What's left is a set of clauses that suppress wages, limit mobility, and slow down the spread of ideas. That's why we're acting. By banning non-compete clauses for low and middle income workers, we'll ban them for 9 out of 10 of the workers covered by the Fair Work Act. Childcare workers, security guards, brickies, retail workers, hospitality staff, nurses shouldn't be forced to get permission to use their own skills. The reform doesn't stand alone. We're also banning wage fixing and no-poach agreements, the backroom deals where firms quietly agree not to hire one another's staff. These agreements don't just stifle competition. They make a mockery of the idea of a free labour market. Getting the details right matters. Treasury's consultation asked how the ban should be defined, how it should be enforced, and how to make sure it works in practice. The submissions gave us a wealth of advice. Some were short and sharp. One worker simply wrote, "Please get rid of these clauses, they're ruining my life." Others ran to dozens of pages of legal analysis. Together, they're helping shape the legislation that'll come before Parliament. Good reform takes time. Contracts need to be updated, employers need to adjust, and workers need to understand their new rights. That's why the start date is 2027. Between now and then, we'll continue to consult, to draft carefully, and to make sure this change is introduced smoothly. The principle, though, is simple. Australians should be free to use their skills. They should be free to change jobs without fear of a legal letter. They should be free to start a business if they have an idea. A healthy labour market depends on freedom to move. And taking effect in 2027, that freedom will be restored. Non-competes are one part of a much larger puzzle. Our aim isn't just to free up workers, but to make the whole economy more competitive and dynamic. It's why we've already enacted the most significant reform of Australia's merger laws in half a century. For too long, mergers slipped through with little scrutiny, leaving markets more concentrated and consumers paying higher prices. The new regime puts competition first, so the deals are judged on whether they help markets stay open and fair. Also revitalising national competition policy, the landmark reform agenda of the 1990s that helped deliver a lasting boost to living standards. This new phase is tailored for the challenges of today's economy. The priorities include streamlining planning and zoning so new firms can enter, recognising overseas standards more easily so consumers have cheaper and safer products, supporting modular construction to lift productivity, introducing nationally consistent worker screening to boost mobility and care, and broadening rights to repair so people aren't forced to throw out what they could fix. We're doing this with evidence, not guesswork. The Competition Task Force in Treasury is using microdata to identify concentration hotspots across the economy, places where markets are already too concentrated and where further consolidation would hurt competition. The vision's simple. We want an economy that looks less like monopoly, where one player wins the lot, and more like Lego, where everyone can build and create. And unlike monopoly, an economy built on Lego doesn't end up with someone flipping over the board in frustration. Competition reform isn't about theory. It's about lower prices for families, better choices for consumers, and stronger productivity for the nation. It's about making sure talent and ideas can flourish, rather than being bottled up by outdated rules and cosy deals. The ban on non-competes is part of this bigger story. It removes silent shackles from millions of workers, just as merger reforms rein in concentration and national competition policy lowers barriers to entry. Piece by piece, we're building an economy that's more open, more dynamic and fairer. So let me finish where I began, with the workers whose stories came through in the consultation. A laundromat manager told she couldn't take a job in her own town. A health worker confronted with an indefinite restraint across 2 countries. A young engineer barred from working in his own state for a year. These aren't outliers. They're everyday Australians facing extraordinary restrictions on their freedom to work. Non-compete clauses don't just dampen wages and slow innovation. They don't just widen gender and racial pay gaps. They cut against values that Australians hold dear: freedom and fairness. The freedom to put your skills to use, to move when a better job beckons, to start something new. And the fairness of being paid what you're worth, without artificial restraints holding you back. By scrapping non-competes for the vast majority of workers, we're restoring both freedom and fairness. We're unbinding people from contracts that told them to stand still when they wanted to move forward. We're levelling the playing field so that opportunity depends on talent and effort, not whether your boss decides to clip your wings. And we're doing it alongside broader reforms that tackle concentration and strengthen competition across the economy. Together, these changes ensure not just better markets, but a fairer society in which Australians are free to pursue their ambitions. Because competition policy isn't just about prices and productivity. At its heart, it's about freedom and fairness. It's about unbinding workers, unbinding ideas, and unbinding the potential of Australia's future. Unlike a non-compete clause, that's something we should all be free to sign up to. Thanks very much. Look forward to your questions.
So many thanks for an important talk. So we'll come into question and discussion. I'll be operating the microphones on this third of the room and Jacqueline on the other 2/3 of the room. So just start off with a brief request for information, then a brief question. I guess non-competes only apply if someone gets a payout, right? Because if you don't get a payout of a job, why would you sign up? And secondly, what are you getting any kind of pushback to what you're proposing to come in 2027? And if so, what's the kind of pushback you're getting from business or wherever?
Thanks, Gerard. Yes, non-competes mostly are showing up in contracts where there isn't a payout. There's no gardening leave. There's simply a clause that says if you leave, then you can't work at a competitor for a fixed period of time. Why do workers sign up to this? Because very few people are negotiating the terms of their exit when they're entering a new employment relationship. It's probably a bit gauche to sit there haggling over what would happen if you left. So many people just take the standard form agreement and just sign at the bottom. We've had a range of different views. Certainly some in business have argued that this is an important way of protecting intellectual property. We've encouraged them to think about non-competes as really being the bluntest tool in the shed and to focus instead on confidentiality, non-disclosure and intellectual property as ways of holding trade secrets. From workers' groups, we've got the call for the reform to start earlier. It doesn't kick off until 2027, as I've said, but there's been an argument made that it should extend to more workers and start sooner. So that's been some of what's come through in the 40-odd submissions in the latest consultation process.
Thank you, Dr. Leigh. A question about the new mandatory merger regime. I think it's clear that there's broad support for strong merger laws that stop anti-competitive deals that might otherwise raise costs for consumers and reduce productivity. But when we look at the new merger regime, what we're seeing in practice is that it's applying to a range of standard business transactions. For example, the first two that have been notified to the ACCC are agreements for lease over standard sort of business arrangements, warehouses and the like. Perhaps maybe an instance of the blowtorch being used on the marshmallow. So my question is, in the name of productivity, which seems to be an important agenda for the government at the moment, would the government be amenable to making changes to the regime to make sure that it is truly targeted at the most problematic mergers rather than those that are ordinary course business transactions?
No, thanks, lawyers. We've certainly done a lot of consultation and made a range of changes, including as they applied to lease arrangements. We're always open to fresh ideas, but the consultation process has been very extensive. From the outset, the Competition Task Force worked with stakeholders in shaping up the reform, and then there was a number of changes made on various iterations. In instances in which there's low-risk mergers, we're aiming to get them approved very, very quickly. So the objective of this process is for notifiable merger approval to go through fast and simply for low-risk mergers, so the ACCC is able to focus its attention on high-risk mergers. But very happy to discuss the specifics of the case you raise, if that's useful.
That was a great talk. Hard to imagine anybody disagreeing with it, although I suppose in Parliament people might. My question really is, you talk about it applying to people under the threshold of about 180, 190,000. There's quite a lot of activity above that, particularly in the financial services sector. And in that sector, this issue of stealing intellectual property really is of quite concern. People walk out with address books, not literally, but address books in their heads. So if we rely on confidentiality agreements, that puts the onus on the ex-employer to have to take action against the ex-employee who may be trying to siphon off business. So my question really is, have you thought about extending the threshold above 180, 190?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. We've certainly taken on a range of suggestions as to what we might do over that threshold. We want to make sure that we're promoting productivity. One of the approaches taken in other countries is to require mandatory compensation of employees to say, well, if you're going to restrain an ex-employee for 6 months, then you need to pay them a certain share of their earnings. I think in Portugal it's 40% of the wage. And so that then ensures that employers don't put the clause in willy-nilly, but only do it where they've really got something to protect. But from the standpoint of the economy, there's probably a pretty big productivity cost here. A friend of mine has just started a fintech startup, and after leaving one of the big four banks, his non-compete clause meant that he couldn't start his fintech for 6 months after leaving. So that's 6 months that 6 months later that the economy got this fintech. If you think it's going to have a significant impact on the economy and it now employs 100 people, then that kind of a constraint is plausibly having an even bigger cost on productivity than the constraints imposed on security guards and early childhood workers. So we're thinking very carefully about that through the consultation, but moving swiftly for the 9 out of 10 employees, where, as you say, there's pretty strong consensus. Please indulge me. It is wonderful to have my former boss, Michael Kirby, in the room, a man from whom I learned more than anyone except my parents. So, Michael, it's a real honour to have you here tonight.
Thanks, Andrew. I agree basically with your thesis, but I also agree with the previous questioner in the sense that I think you're slightly underestimating the degree to which an employer has a whole range of modus operandi that aren't capable of being protected by intellectual property law, but which are imparted on the employee who, if he or she departs, they take it with them and then potentially inform the competitor of how to do things. And then the second thing is that the moving employee can also take customers and clients with them to a competitor with whom they've formed a personal connection, but that's at the behest of the previous employer, and yet the subsequent employer gets the benefit. So would you like to comment?
Absolutely. So, I do think it's always important that governments are focused on the interests of the entire economy, not just the interests of incumbent firms. What is in the interests of all of us collectively may not be in the interests of those who are in place at the moment. And I sort of feel for some of the business organisations who are responding to our consultation. They're responding on behalf of the incumbent employers. No one is writing a submission on behalf of the startups that don't yet exist, who might well be more productive and faster growing than the current firms. So we want to take that whole of economy approach, even if the benefit to startups is in some cases also imposing some cost on the incumbents. But the other thing is, if you've really got secret sauce, I talked about the recipe for Coca-Cola before, you don't want to use a non-compete to hold that, because you can only use a non-compete for, maybe a year, 2. I can't imagine any court allowing a non-compete beyond that to be enforceable. So if that's your idea of holding the recipe for KFC's herbs and spices, then you're gone, right? An employee is going to leave, sit out the non-compete, and then put it into place. What you want to hold true business secrets is confidentiality and intellectual property, because there you have an enduring approach which is targeted to the harm and is able to ensure that you don't lose that secret benefit, but also that secret, but also doesn't hold back the career of the worker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leigh. Fantastic talk. What is the cost to the economy if we don't implement this? And do you envisage a big bang rollout or an incremental rollout with controlled trials?
Wonderful question. I am wearing my I Love Evidence badge, and you're quite right to say that in some cases I would love to see randomised trials. In this case, we're implementing it right across the economy. If I was putting on my economics professor hat, you might look for a discontinuity at $183,000 and see whether there's changes in mobility at that point. The E61 Institute also had some quite nice quasi-experimental identification strategies as they're looking at it. But the benefit to the economy, I think, will be in the billions of dollars. You know, if you're talking about $2,500 per affected worker, and a fifth of workers are affected, that's $500 on average per worker in the economy. So billions of dollars right across the economy, is certainly commensurate with a significant tax cut for many workers.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Minister. Thank you for the beautiful speech. I think you've made some very compelling points, and it sounds fairly straightforward to ban non-competes for people below a certain income threshold. My question is, why is the government delaying introducing this for 2 years? Because it sounds fairly straightforward, and as you've laid out, these non-competes are dragging productivity in the economy. Similarly, dragging out the implementation of banning non-competes would also drag productivity in the economy. You know, what's stopping the government from introducing this, say, 1 January?
No, it's a strong question. I should also say people should be calling me Andrew. I feel uncomfortable when I get called titles. We're aiming to try and ensure that businesses have time to adjust, and that this is a reform where people are able to take account of what the government's doing in writing new contracts. We want to provide maximum certainty in the economy, and the consultations with business have led us to that longer time. I remember the economics commentator Ross Gittins once saying to me that when he began his career, he really hated the idea of grandfathered reforms. But he said, after you've worked as an economics commentator for a couple of decades, in some sense, you've gotten to see the long run, and you recognise that if reforms can be brought in with a bit of a lead time, and that manages any potential backlash, then it's well worth doing. And that's the approach we've taken here.
Minister, thank you for coming. You might be able to answer a question which has been bothering me for a while, and it does relate to quite ultimately to quite a lot of what you've said tonight. Why would Labor spend taxpayers' money on a 3 days conference on reform and productivity, and you are the Minister for Productivity, when they don't mention two of the most important things for productivity, ultimately, which is industrial relations and energy?
Well, thanks very much, Peter. I had the privilege of being in the Cabinet room for the full 3 days of the Economic Reform Roundtable. Terrific, robust conversation. Certainly industrial relations was raised. There was a good degree of consensus around a whole range of issues, the way in which artificial intelligence is used, boosting skills in the economy, duplicate regulation and how that's affecting housing and the clean energy rollout. I was pleasantly surprised at the extent to which people in the room were taking off their sectional interest hats and putting on their national interest hats. And it was a different way of doing these kinds of conversations. You know, you think back to Hawke's big economic roundtable, or to the tax summit that we held in government in 2012. This was a much more intimate gathering, which meant participants really got to know one another, and I think then felt much more trusting in exchanging ideas. We didn't solve the world's problems, but I think it was well worth doing in terms of the reform agenda that helped empower. Thank you.
Minister, let me put a big question on the table. We had competition between the states on income tax until 1942 during the war, and competition, particularly in the case of Queensland and Joe when he went to do away with the death tax, had a very significant change in the centralisation of taxing power with the Commonwealth. That prevented the country from having the advantage the United States has, look at California and Texas today, with competition between the states and encouraging movement from a less productive to a more productive environment. What do you say about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I studied in the States, I was introduced to the idea of Tibu sorting, the notion that it is good to have a country divided up into smaller jurisdictions that offer people different bundles of taxes and services. So you can choose the high tax, high service jurisdiction, or the low tax, low service jurisdiction, or indeed the jurisdiction, Florida, which offers much better services to older people and much worse services to younger people. That notion was completely foreign to me as an Australian, coming from a country where people don't typically think about the size of government when they choose to move. There's not a great degree of differentiation. I suppose we've got, traditionally had a little bit between Victoria and Queensland, perhaps at our biggest extremes, and there was a period where the migration flows of retirees from Victoria to Queensland, of which my grandparents were a part, might have suggested to you that people were choosing to move to the lower tax jurisdiction. We have a little bit of that in payroll tax, which, as you know, is essentially a tax on employees and the economic incidence. But you're right, we don't have it in income tax. We have some of it going on with land taxes on business, but it's on business attraction, really, where you see taboo sorting happening in Australia. I don't get the sense that states are sitting around their cabinet tables saying, how do we attract migrants through our mix of taxes and spending?
I work with children and young people as a lawyer, and I regularly see unscrupulous things in contracts. What's the penalty or consequences for firms that include non-compete clauses after they're banned?
So we haven't decided on what that approach will be. I mean, I did flag up the concern that there might still be a chilling effect if unenforceable clauses were allowed. In the area of competition law, we banned unfair contract terms as one of the first bits of legislation that went through Parliament in 2022. The approach that we took was that the former government had made unfair contract terms unenforceable, but they were still showing up in contracts and still having adverse effects on consumers and on competition. So we moved to actually put penalties in place for businesses that imposed unfair contract terms on small business. That's certainly one approach we could take here. It might also be an approach that could be considered further down the track. You might think that early on there are inadvertent instances of non-compete still showing up, but that's less likely further down the track. So all of those options are on the table, but our main focus is on getting the ban in place. And finally, thanks for your work. It sounds really important work.
I've got a question that someone sent in earlier who can't be here, probably because of the question, I suspect. You're from the ACT. How come is it that Labor and the Greens and the Teals get such a huge vote in the ACT, and what's wrong with the Liberals?
Well, we don't get everyone. I mean, at the last election, there was 26% of people in my electorate who didn't vote for me. It's extraordinary. So we are working on that 26%. We only got a 74% two-party vote. I think it was the choice that was made at the last election to make the public service cuts such a focus of the campaign. I did really feel for the Liberals' lead Senate candidate in the ACT, who was essentially forced to say, if you vote for us, then I will be a voice in the party room to argue for the policy that we're advocating to be scrapped. What else could he do? It was the position that he'd been placed in. More broadly, I also look at a Liberal Party at the moment that seems to be, and Gerard, maybe you'd have a different view on this, the Liberal Party now seems to be a bit where the Labor Party was in the 1950s. We had a significant number of people in the Labor Party in the 50s who felt that ideological purity was more important than government, that it was really critical to be right on the key issues, even if being right on those key issues made you unelectable. And in the fight over net zero, a policy supported by the Business Council of Australia, a policy supported by every state and territory, a policy put in place in Australia by Scott Morrison. The fight to repeal that, I think, does indicate that the Liberal Party is putting itself in a place where it's going to be quite hard for it to be the strong opposition that the country needs it to be. I say that as a member of a party whose political interest is not in the rehabilitation of the Liberal Party, but I do think it's in the national interest that the Liberal Party, again, sees the value of aspiring to be a party of government, not a party of ideological purity.
But to be fair to the questioner, I think Liberals haven't won a seat in the ACT and the House of Representatives for 50 years, then, right? 1977, John Haslam.
No, they picked up the seat of Canberra in 1996. But yes, it's been a long time since the Liberal Party had a federal seat, and then at an ACT level, it's been 2 decades.
The 1996 one was what, for only for one term, I guess, was it?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. The Liberal Party in the ACT is very small, which leaves it vulnerable to the same problem, the same dynamic that I was talking about before of the control of the party falling into the hands of people who are more concerned with culture war issues than median voter issues.
But it could be because a lot of public servants vote Labor at any rate.
Look, it's all so. If you look at capital cities of, I'm trying to be as much of a kind of political science professor rather than a politician, if I can answer any questions. If you look at seats of government around the world, the kind of Ottawas and Washington DCs and so on, they typically are held by parties of the left. That's true. But the ACT has had Liberal governments, and it would be, again, good for the ACT to have a stronger opposition.
Thank you very much for coming to the Sydney Institute and putting forward a very cogent case. I'm very proud of you, and I think it's great when we have politicians on all sides of Parliament who can come forward and put forward such well thought out policies and is engaged and apparently committed to consultation before proceeding to legislation. But as I was sitting here hearing what you were expounding, the question occurred to me, did anybody really try to approach the common law again? Did anybody try to go to the courts? As you pointed out, there was a bias of the courts in favour of competition, and I would think that would still be there. And some of the ways things have developed, maybe in lower courts, have been taken more seriously than the higher courts intended, the necessity to ensure that the market is not oppressed by these agreements between particular parties. So what was the history of Australia's court decisions on restraint of trade? Has there been any attempt in the past to get the courts to make a decision? I'm in favour of getting a parliamentary decision if you can get it. But the history of Australia is that there have been lots of proposals and then governments lose enthusiasm for them and they don't get through. And that's the question you were asked about. Why are you putting through such a long lead time? So maybe you can come back to think of that in terms of what the common law could do here, just in case this doesn't go through.
No, thank you, Judge. And we're certainly aware that when these cases come to court, sometimes they are found, the clauses are found invalid. The thing that struck us through the consultation, it was one of the submissions made the point that one of the legal centres said that of the 100 or so cases of non-compete clauses that they had provided advice on, only one ultimately went to court. And I think it's that the cases that go to court are involving executives on high six-figure salaries. And so for an early childhood worker, it's just not worth anyone's time to fight it out in court. So they're having this chilling effect on the economy, and the transaction costs, if you like, the legal costs are just well above the foregone earnings, making it impractical for people to litigate on this. But we will have to think about some of the edge cases. The Fair Work Act, as you know better than anyone in the room, doesn't cover all workers in Australia. So we'll work with states and territories on their approach, and that may well involve some of the sort of common law approaches that you've flagged.
Minister, one contradiction that I picked up tonight is the difference between what I obviously strongly encourage in competition, and there shouldn't be restraints on competition wherever it can be avoided for the eventual benefit of the economy and individuals. when it comes to the labour legislation, particularly, for instance, as it applies to the Pilbara today, it seems to me that the industrial relations changes have, in a sense, discouraged the ability of an employer to be able to provide whatever benefits and payments that they want to their workers, while at the same time, in recent stuff you've no doubt read about, the industrial organisers of the unions are having difficulty in trying to affect a change in the labour movement's advantage relative to the competitive position that has been established in the Pilbara now for a very long time.
No, thanks, Richard. And I think what you're going to is the use of temporary work arrangements in parallel to regular work arrangements. Our legislation effectively hit two big employers, Qantas and BHP, which had made extensive use of temporary work arrangements. Temps were, in the past, people that came into offices to do a job briefly and then went back. But the rise of temporary work with workers employed on lower pay than those they're working alongside had become a real issue across the economy. So our legislation did what it said on the tin: same job, same pay. If you're being employed to do the work which is the same as somebody who's next to you on an industrial agreement, then you should be paid the same as them. And employers shouldn't be able to make an end run around the Fair Work Act by setting up these shadow workforces using temporary work. Most employers weren't doing that. That wasn't happening even across the miners, wasn't happening even across the airlines. There were just a couple of big employers engaged in that. And last time I checked, the profit lines for BHP and Qantas were still pretty healthy, despite now being required to comply with same job, same pay.
One of our members in Monero asked a question to me early in the day. Do you ever regret not having joined a faction?
No, and thank you to your member for calling in from Eden Monero. It's always good when people can give their electorates, and I can give a shout out to my neighbour Christy McBain for the great work she does.
Andrew, you've made a compelling case for why you should act to prevent the non-compete clauses, particularly for that cohort of people you described. I don't think you've made a compelling case to delay it to 2027. I think you need to do more work on the case for why it should be delayed, or find some other pathway through. It does seem to me you were prepared in 2022 to act decisively in relation to big business versus small business. Whole term later, and you're putting it off to the end of this term. And it doesn't seem to me to be a compelling case as to why you should wait that long.
Mark, if I'm smiling slightly at your question, it's only because I did have a feeling that I might be walking into the lion's den this evening, and I was not expecting one of the final questions to be, the real problem with what you're arguing is you're not doing it fast enough. So I welcome the question. I certainly take that criticism. It is just a balance of what we believe needs to be done with the appropriate consultation with business. This has been identified as a problem for a long time, but when it's been identified, there's been a range of pretty fierce voices against it. And if you look at the Financial Review opinion page, for example, the opinion articles there would be running strongly against non-compete reform. We've really aimed to have that constructive relationship with business, to give people time to adjust, to set the high income earner threshold, and then to say we'll have a careful consultation about what we do above that. But I think what you're pointing to, Mark, is the reality of getting sensible government reform through in a way that doesn't have us picking fights right across our reform agenda. You can have a broader reform agenda if you're doing it in a way that brings people along and allows businesses time to accommodate.
Final question. If one assumes you haven't written another book before the end of this term, and you came back before the end of this term, what do you think you'd be able to tell us about your achievements over 3 years?
I would love to be able to talk about what we've done on the evidence front. We've set up the Australian Centre for Evaluation. We've got a range of randomised trials that are coming out from that, really bringing that approach that has served medicine so well through to public policy. Being a little bit more modest about what we know, a little bit more scientific and critical about how we evaluate policies, and a little bit more dexterous, more willing to change course as the evidence pushes in different directions. So if the opportunity arose, Gerard, I would love to be able to expand a little bit and have those ideas tested in front of your wonderful crowd.
So, big crowd here. I'll be brief. Many thanks to Andrew Leigh for another great talk here. Significant, be shown on TV, but also published in the Sydney papers when that comes out. And we'll love to have you back, book or no book. Well done.